Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a blood-soaked expedition through history that's less Game of Thrones and more stumbling drunkenly through a dark alley of despair with shoddy weaponry. That's right, this is Why It Sucked to Be a Medieval Assassin and more. Forget the romanticized tales of cunning rogues and shadowy figures lurking in the moonlight. Join us as we shine a bright, embarrassing spotlight on the sobering reality of being a medieval hit person, where job security was about as stable as a Jenga tower in a windstorm, and social status was somewhere just above that of a raccoon scavenging for scraps. Assassins, those delightful denizens of the dark, were the original anti-heroes. But unlike the sleek killers of today's action films, these guys had to deal with a laundry list of grimy living conditions, constant betrayal, and the depressing truth that they had to navigate a society that largely wished for them to just, well, disappear. We'll dive into tales that are both hilariously ironic and tragically absurd. Like the assassin who intended to take out a target but accidentally became the star of a complete farcical disaster. Think of it as medieval slapstick, with more blood and fewer laugh tracks. We'll uncover the bizarre fate of those who found themselves on the wrong end of a contract that came furnished with no benefits, no health insurance, and a job description that read, "likely to end in untimely death." Through a series of disheartening anecdotes, desperate schemes, and plenty of slap-in-the-face irony. Because what's life without a little tragic comedy? We'll explore why not just anyone could glide stealthily through the shadows like a nimble ninja, and instead ended up slipping on banana peels in the chaos of history. So sit back, pour yourself a goblet of something strong and alcoholic, and get ready to realize that being an assassin in medieval times might have been the worst gig since drinking out of a dirty trough. Brace yourself, because it's going to be a bloody good time. The clocks chimed ominously, signifying the year was 1303, likely in a dingy pub in the village of Last Hope, a place where one could drown their sorrows and still have enough money left to buy a hoof of old cheese. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that danced suspiciously over the room, as if even the inanimate objects were trying to escape the fate of an untimely death by stew. If you caught a whiff of something strange in the air, it wasn't the after effects of the so-called elixir of courage the regulars consumed. No, it was merely the lingering scent of rotten cabbages and desperation. In one grimy corner sat Adam the Reluctant, an assassin who had somehow become the unwitting heir to a series of contracts so overdue that even the tax collector was embarrassed for him. Clad in threadbare leather and an enthusiasm for procrastination, he stared at the parchment in front of him as if it were a venomous snake triggered to strike. Beside him was his counterpart, Grethel the Unpaid, an accountant who was only 2 coins away from poverty, and, ironically, still wearing the latest fashion made from what can only be described as "Yar, I'll raid your face off" chic. With mugs of dubious ale serving as their only allies, the duo concocted what would become the world's first unwieldy contract for unpaid bills, complete with a list of all the unfortunate souls who had considered stiffing a known assassin. "You owe me for that last contract, Reginald," Adam lamented, scratching out the name of a particularly slippery client. "And what about the baker? She still hasn't paid for the forgettable encounter at the festival." In medieval times, the concept of a contract was as straightforward as a Shakespeare play, complex, confusing, and designed primarily for those clever enough to dodge it. According to the absurd tradition, contracts were sealed with a kiss, and by kiss, we mean a grimy paw print that resembled the hand of a creature that had just mistakenly insisted on attending a roofing job. So, there they were, crafting an incomprehensible masterpiece that would solve their cash flow crisis, and entirely miss the point of basic arithmetic. This delightful procedure took a detour once Grethel decided to spice the paperwork up with a dollop of magical enchantment. Because who wouldn't want a financial pact supported by an ancient incantation? Suddenly, every time Adam missed a payment reminder, a cursed toad would materialize and croak an alarm at midnight, alerting the designated debtor that they were next on the hit list of unfortunate consequences. Consequentially, the tension continued to build as word spread throughout Last Hope. Soon, locals were darting behind barrels and pretending to be deeply invested in a game of dice, rather than confronting their impending doom. They feared as they feasted on utterly bland gruel, the only food that really brought everyone together in medieval poverty. That gruel seemed far more sinister when you thought the invisible assassins hanging around might be coming for both your life and your last quarter cup of oats. The twist? It turned out the bulk of the debtors were simply chickens. Not even figurative chickens, actual chickens running wild and living rent-free in Last Hope. After a frantic tantrum of spilled ink and crinkled paper, it was revealed that instead of regaling him with tales of unpaid contracts, Grethel had accidentally recorded hen trouble, and those babies were on the wrong end of the negotiations. In the end, Adam the Reluctant had no choice but to track down the nest of thieves and arrange a lethal flock reduction. If only unwritten contracts came with walkie-talkies and a side of insight. As Adam left the village, he considered the real lesson here. Never try to enact vengeance upon unpaid poultry, because overdue payments never include the price of fighting clucks. Welcome to the 14th century, where your closest friends are the ones you haven't assassinated yet. The setting: a smoky, dimly lit tavern where the floors are sticky with unknown substances, and the entertainment consists of a lute player who knows one song, but performs it on a loop with increasing fervor. The tavern's aroma? A delightful blend of stale beer, burnt meat, and what we can only assume is the after effect of the Black Death. Enter our main character, Sir Geoffrey of unfortunate circumstances, a local assassin by trade and social outcast by necessity. Missing an eye, with a beard so wild it could house a family of squirrels, Geoffrey struts to the bar like a wounded peacock among chickens. He peers longingly at the lively groups of patrons, all laughing uproariously over a pitcher of something that might be ale or an especially dark brew of regret. Of course, for Geoffrey, mingling isn't an option. Being a medieval assassin comes with a serious social stigma. Why? Because it's hard to form friendships when every handshake could unintentionally lead to a performative assassination on your behalf. Case in point, a cordial encounter at last month's village festival resulted in 2 dead but rather confused knights and a pending execution warrant attached to Geoffrey's name. As he sips on a mug of suspicious swill, he leans into the bar, bracing himself for a night full of solitude and unintentional self-reflection. His thoughts wander to food, specifically the uninteresting barley gruel they serve in this sorry excuse for a banquet hall. Oh, the irony. Even gruel required social finesse. Too thick, and your peers suspect you might be hoarding food for sinister purposes. Too thin, and they're likely to think you a coward. Tonight, however, he'd been invited to a feast, an offer he assumed was a joke, or part of some twisted prank involving a few nobles who thought it would be hilarious to test him on his poison-immune status. The evening promised roasted boar, overflowing platters of bread, and for dessert, a fear-inducing concoction they called tempting tarts of treachery. Who wouldn't want to mingle with friends when the main course comes with a side of paranoia? Among the invited guests was Lord Edric, a guy so famous for his innuendo about peasants being coerced into servitude that his very presence reeked of condescending nostalgia. But Geoffrey had no choice. If he declined the invite, he'd be labeled the assassin who avoids social gatherings. And social rejection was the real killer here. To top it off, there was a rumor going around about a particularly nasty strain of scurvy, a fate worse than having your assassinated friends haunt your basement. As the feast progressed, the food was as sensational as one could expect from medieval gastronomy, which is to say, gloriously overcooked and undoubtedly plagued by questionable hygiene practices. Sir Geoffrey tried to engage in banter, but every time he laughed, he inadvertently spat bits of roast on Edric's silk collar, promptly leading to a jealous barrage of whispers about how the assassin was making a name for himself as a social faux pas artist. Then came the grand reveal. Dessert. The tempting tarts of treachery were revealed, and suddenly, silence fell across the table. Assassins and nobles alike looked on with a mix of hunger and dread. One slight cough ripped through the ballroom, igniting a camaraderie of horrified contemplation. Was this really just dessert, or was it loaded with treachery? As it turns out, they weren't poisoned. It was merely the dregs of last week's fruit harvest, combined with a dash of something vaguely resembling custard. Geoffrey watched as each guest took a reluctant bite, their faces morphing from anticipation to confusion, and finally to resigned acceptance of their life choices. All the while, Sir Geoffrey remained untouched. His social death was complete, all because he couldn't engage in a deadly dessert dance with nobles who saw him as merely a pawn in their royal games. In the end, the moral of the evening was this. In the complicated social tapestry of the medieval world, it's not the blade that cuts the deepest, but the double-edged betrayal served after dinner. So remember, make sure your company has an appetite for more than just bloodshed. Unless you're dining with Sir Geoffrey, in which case, expect the feast to be filled with regret. In the dark underbelly of medieval society, the 13th century was a veritable buffet of violence and ambition. Picture this scene. A dimly lit tavern that smelled suspiciously of ale-soaked straw and despair. Not an unusual ambiance when your beverage choices are either mead or the local sewage runoff. Gathered around the rickety wooden tables were rogues and scoundrels conspiring about the latest trend in assassination techniques while avoiding the watchful eyes of nobody, because honestly, who cared at this point? In this charming establishment known as the No Hope Inn, a group of jobless assassins, yes, jobless, open positions were few and far between due to an oversaturation of highly motivated self-starters willing to stab their way up the career ladder, exchanged tales that could make a jester weep. Their dinner for the evening? A suspiciously bland bowl of turnip stew, served lukewarm by a haggard serving wench who knew far too much and far too little, all at the same time. Yet this wasn't merely a hearty supper, this was a meal steeped in paranoia and just the slightest hint of rancid meat. As scents wafted through the air, a bizarre bouquet consisting of onions stifled by the overzealous hanging of old fish, a brief silence fell as one assassin stood up, clutching his bowl with a determination usually reserved for a knight facing off against a dragon. "Gentlemen," he proclaimed, "this stew could contain anything. Poison, nightshade, a grudge from the last noble I didn't finish off." His comrades nodded sagely, wide-eyed at this sage observation, until one chap, sporting an ill-fitted cap and a look of cornered rabbit, piped up, "I just think it's too hot. You want to taste test it for me?" A wave of nervous laughter accompanied the solid notion that this was more than just dinner. It was a passive-aggressive game of mortal peril. This is where tensions soared and tempers flared as discussions of possible culinary sabotage erupted into absurd paranoia. What if that turnip was a former spy for the king? What if he was maneuvering for a promotion in the stew hierarchy? The air was thick with haze, occasionally interrupted by the tiny puffs created by an equally paranoid dwarf who seemed to think floor rats were implicitly in on the plot too. Their debates delved into ludicrous superstitions such as the curse of the turnip, an ancient tale suggesting that any assassin who dared to feast on this root vegetable would be pursued by vengeful spirits of failed missions. As they spoke, the tavern's atmosphere shifted from one of rumination to that of a historically inaccurate horror film, complete with a shivering bard in the corner working on his new ballad titled "The Stab But Never Returned." With each minute, the suspense grew as glances were exchanged. Forks hovered innocently over the bowls, and the server, now dubbed the Harbinger of Doom by one particularly dramatic assassin, returned uncomfortably to refill tankards. Yet, when the pivotal moment arrived, when the bravest member, clad in what appeared to be a coat made of various haphazard animal pelts, began to take the first bite, the world held its breath. As the stew met his tongue, an expectant hush enveloped the room, climaxing the tension that arguably could rival medieval politics. He sputtered, eyes bulging. Had he been poisoned? Had vengeful spirits claimed him? And then, poofed, it's just cold. Alarm quickly devolved back into laughter, and what could have resulted in an unfortunate chain of murder accusations turned into an uproarious round of debating whether the barmaid could save the day with merely a handful of spice. And so the evening trundled along, with laughter replacing the tension. No assassins were harmed, and everyone forgot the very first rule of professional attempting to kill. Things. If you're going to die over a meal, at least make it one with more flavor. So, what's the life lesson here? Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the table isn't the meat. It's the cook's interpretation of an ancient recipe that leaves you wondering if you've crossed over into an alternative dimension of blandness. Picture it. The year is 1325, and the place is the bustling market square of a small medieval town where the scent of haggis mingles with the screams of freshly slaughtered chickens, a veritable feast for the senses. The backdrop? A gray stone castle overlooking the chaos, where our not-so-heroic assassin, Reginald the Nefarious, prepares for his big culinary mission. He is on a quest to procure the perfect dish for his next big hit. Reginald, despite his dubious title, isn't just any assassin. He's the poster boy for medieval unfortunate events. A dashing rogue, if you squint your eyes and ignore the rash on his neck, he wanders through the market, dodging his sworn enemies who were, ironically, just trying to buy milk. The ambiance is rife with merchants hawking wares, the sound of wooden carts creaking, and folks attempting to haggle over incredibly overpriced wilted cabbages. All around him, a cacophony of laughter, and the distant twangs of a lute spiral into the afternoon buzz, as if suggesting nothing's quite as comically tragic as the man on a stealthy mission while being utterly useless at stealth. Now, at the center of this absurdity lies today's coveted dish. Roasted rabbit seasoned with a sprinkle of despair and a dash of regret. Ironically, the last remains of the previous town's non-existent rabbits. The dish draws admiring glances from onlookers, because what screams "look at me"? I'm totally not an assassin, quite like a lavishly prepared meal in a medieval market. However, our misfortunate assassin is not just battling the meat on the spit. No, he's up against 100 superstitions and absurd medieval rituals concocted by folks with far too much time on their hands. Before even thinking of snagging that rabbit, he must navigate a maze of insanity. First, he's wafting garlic around to ward off pesky spirits and any chance of success at romance. Next, he's constantly checking his own reflection in the gleaming shields of passing knights, convinced that any sign of facial hair might signal fate's displeasure and doom any chance he has at success. Talk about a paranoid personality. With the rabbit finally in his hot little hands, Reginald prepares to escape, all while attempting to shun the absurd lighting of the nearby candlelit fortune-teller's booth, which could indeed alter his fate. The minstrels in the background ramp up the tension, launching into a heartfelt ballad about a tragic hero, completely missing the irony that they're singing about a man carrying slaughtered animals while preparing to commit, well, let's just say a culinary critical faux pas. As he turns to leave, disaster strikes. He trips on a bag of rotten vegetables, or as they call them in medieval times, lunch, and sends the rabbit flying through the air. The crowd gasps, a dog barks, and the rabbit lands gracefully, unscathed, in the clutches of the local baker, who, unbeknownst to Reginald, is notorious for punching assassins in the face for treachery. Not only has he lost his meal, but Reginald has unknowingly become a contestant in the medieval version of a food fight. And just like that, the entire market erupts into chaos. Bystanders take sides, with half cheering for the bewildered baker, while the other half egg on Reginald with chants of rabbits of justice. The baker wields his rolling pin like a weapon of mass destruction, while Reginald, in a panic, attempts to negotiate a peaceful resolution using leftover cabbage as a bargaining chip. Who knew diplomacy could be so deliciously absurd? Finally, by sheer luck or a badly timed sneeze, the baker slips on the cabbage, falls backward into a cart of squashed tomatoes, and Reginald, now a legend in his own lunchtime, escapes amidst the commotion with a bag of bread, somehow managing to become the unintentional hero of the day. So what can we take away from this epic fail of an attempt at cunning? In the world of medieval assassins, mayhem reigns supreme, and mastering the art of culinary thievery is definitely not on the curriculum. Remember, never underestimate the sheer distraction power of a flying rabbit, especially when it's destined for someone else's dinner plate. Take a deep breath. The air smells like opportunity. Or is that betrayal? Welcome to the year 1180, a time when being an assassin was the medieval equivalent of being a corporate intern, full of promise, but mostly just a series of backstabbing events. We find ourselves in the bustling streets of Baghdad, where the aroma of spices competes for dominance with the wafts of dried blood and betrayal. Maybe it's a Tuesday. Who can keep track when you're plotting murder for gold? Let's set the scene. A drab tavern tucked between two dilapidated buildings that could barely qualify as shelters rather than storage sheds. Flickering oil lanterns illuminate a room cluttered with every smell you'd expect when people mix cheap ale with questionable food. The constant clinking of metal mugs and the distant grunting of dubious patrons create a cacophony that rivals any battle cry. Here, the air is thick with secrets, lies, and the faintest hint of rotting donkey. Perfect for a rendezvous of anonymous assassins. Enter our protagonist, Rafik, a would-be assassin with dreams as lofty as the towering minarets outside. He's got a grimy tunic, a face that could inspire nightmares, and a contract that reads like a wish list. All except for the unfortunate detail that he's supposed to kill a rival merchant's uncle. A man who hasn't even thought of practicing proper target etiquette in decades. Tonight's blend of deathly ambition and desperation culminates in the tavern's special of the day, roasted goat. It's a feast for the eyes, if you squint hard enough. The goat, so charred it has almost achieved the status of a medieval painting, lies on a platter surrounded by an assortment of questionable sides that might or might not include actual sustenance. The only thing fresher than the goat is the rumor of a rival faction ready to swoop in and nab Rafik's glory, or his head. As Rafik prepares to feast while pondering how to execute his murderous plans, he is struck with a wave of paranoia. What if tonight's dish is not what it appears? What if a side of death is just your average Tuesday special? The wild, superstitious heat of the moment creates a raucous storm in his gut. Was that a twitch? What if the goat was a witch in disguise? A nervous patron beside him tips over his drink, sending a cascade of ale as stunning as any medieval battlefield. The room goes silent. Every assassin turns to inspect their food, each one eyeing their neighbor with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for used car salesmen. Their collective anxiety could power a small siege. Suddenly, from the back, a man saunters forward, a self-proclaimed food sommelier with a mustache so meticulously curled it could stab a rival. He leans into Rafik's space, a mix of dubious authority and excessive charisma that could put a bard to shame. "Gentlemen," he begins in a voice that wobbles between condescension and panic. The goat has been cursed by the spirit of Khalid the Resentful himself, a man poisoned by his enemies while enjoying a banquet he didn't even remember ordering. Cue the gasps. A deadly circus of distorted culinary horror unfolds. Rumors ricochet off one another as patrons eye each other's goats, worried they just signed up for the unmarked graveside special. Rafik leans back in his seat, contemplating the exceptional irony of dying at a gourmet feast meant to finance his bloody plans. Perhaps an olive branch and a side of humility next time? Then it happens. A brawl breaks out over goat slices, resulting in a mess not seen since last harvest's grain competition. The patrons, caught between hunger and treachery, engage in a frenzy that adds chaos to confusion. Meanwhile, the cooks are quietly observed in the corners, clutching knives like they're auditioning for a horror film. In the ensuing bedlam, a table crashes and lands, with the entire goat right at Rafik's feet. As he stares at his culinary disaster looming above like a boulder, he realizes he's been summoned to the great culinary court of destiny. A swift kick sends it skidding behind him, and the goat rolls clear across the floor, a comical, dismembered symbol of a sunset career before it even began. As the tavern erupts in laughter, the rumors of witchcraft settle, and Rafik realizes that perhaps he'd need to take a stab at something more original than a simple dinner date gone rogue. Because nothing screams "I'm meant for greatness" like dodging goat parts in a drunken frenzy. So what's the lesson here? Don't let your dreams of glory be eaten by a roast goat. Sometimes the biggest threat to your career comes not from a man with a dagger, but a dude named Horace wielding a plate of confusion on a slippery floor. Cue the dramatic music. The year. Sometime during the 14th century, Europe is in a perpetual state of cold, damp misery, and the sun is about as likely to show its face as a well-intentioned assassin at a family reunion. The location: a lavishly adorned banquet hall in a far too decadent castle, where the scent of roasted boar mingles unpleasantly with anxiety, and the sound of grim laughter echoes like a poorly played lute. Our leading man, Sir Stephen de Just-in-Time, an assassin whose idea of style includes a cloak that swallows more shadows than a tax collector in the dark, waits behind an ornate tapestry depicting knights in exaggerated action poses. His stomach grumbles loud enough to summon the kitchen staff, or perhaps a small army of angry peasants, depending on whether they've eaten that week. Dinner is served, and what delights await: a lavish spread featuring roasted boar, spiced apples, and the pièce de résistance, a suspiciously sparkling wine that is rumored to contain the tears of the vanquished. But for Sir Stephen, it's primarily about survival, not satisfaction. In this elite club of professional killers, food is less of a culinary affair and more of a death sentence waiting to happen. Every dish is scrutinized by at least 2 food tasters, also known as candidates for the Last Supper Club. The boar must pass through the hands of a chef who swears on a stack of holy scriptures that he isn't angry at the Lord or the other chefs who have been known to accidentally pierce their rivals and their meat cuts alike. The apples, only served if they bear no resemblance to a politician's face. As our assassin considers the potential implications of grilled pig combined with a side of paranoia, the nobles seated at the long table are indulging with oblivious gusto, while whispers about an insurgent group seeking vengeance float through the air like a particularly suspect perfume. Sir Stephen's fingers twitch nervously over the hilt of his dagger, conflicted between a professional regard for a fine dinner and the lingering danger that his next meal could be his last. Just as he prepares to make his exit, perhaps to sneak away into the streets and find something far less lethal like stale bread, a member of the hosting family, Lord Reginald the Overzealous, stands up to toast: to honor, to valor, and the right of a lord to take the first bite. With that statement, Lord Reginald, intoxicated by power, plunges his fork into the boar, looking as if he expects it to yield a treasure trove of medieval wisdom. The rest of the court freezes, an orchestra of tension reverberating like a broken lute string. But, lo and behold, instead of collapsing into a heap from arsenic, or some foul concoction meant to induce spectacular fashion failures, he just grins, his face transforming into an unsettling mask of delight. Delicious. Did someone poison this? Cue awkward laughter from the nearby knights, who are all too eager to not mention any previous attempts on their lives, like the time the cheese had exploded with a bang, reminiscent of bad fireworks. Realizing they may have gotten away with yet another day of unexpected vibrancy, Sir Stephen breathes a sigh of relief albeit while contemplating the various assassination attempts lined up in his careers and wondering if this was the most ridiculous one yet. And just like that, the evening carries on. The soup was of questionable origin. Lord Reginald lives another day to annoy the commoners, and Sir Stephen gets swept back into a political power play that continues onto the floors of bustling taverns, become synonymous with the phrase, "Trust food with a side of suspicion." What have we learned from this banquet of bemusement? Always carefully consider your next career move, especially if that career involves food that could cause your untimely demise, or worse still, missing out on the spiced apples. Roll credits and prepare for turmoil. The year? 1471. The location? A lavishly furnished hall somewhere in Italy, where the velvet curtains are more prone to catch fire than ignite your zest for life. In the air hangs the appetizing scent of roasted meat, mingled with the suspicion of simmering treachery. It's the perfect recipe for a royal feast. In the center of this culinary chaos is none other than Duke Giovanni, the man whose ascendant status is matched only by his paranoia. Dressed in enough gold and silk to make a peacock weep, he sits on a throne of plush cushions, surrounded by his hand-picked courtiers, all of whom have that uncomfortably eager look of a hungry rat waiting for any chance to scavenge. The grand hall echoes with laughter, but it's the kind that makes you question every friendship, every backslap, every glass clink. Tonight's meal is not just any banquet, but a buffet of suspicion, topped with a garnish of anxiety. On the menu, a sumptuous feast of roasted peacock, feathers and all, and a decadent chocolate pudding so rich it could fund a small war. Yet, as delicious as it sounds, every dish is tainted with the scent of impending doom. Every bite is an exercise in trust issues. You see, in the medieval world, dining with the Duke wasn't merely about satisfying hunger. It was a high-stakes game of, how do you want to die today? As the Duke's dinner progressed, mouthfuls of cuisine became marinated in paranoia. Each dish had undergone a highly questionable series of medieval safety protocols. These included 1. The servants' loyalty test. Did they look shifty? If yes, dump their stew. 2. The cooking competition. Would bribing the cooks result in something delicious or deadly? 3. The aroma evaluation. If anyone reported suspicious scents, the whole kitchen was put on trial. The tension could be sliced with a butter knife. The Duke eyed his pudding, wondering if the cook had replaced sugar with arsenic. An easy mistake in those times. A single spoonful could yield either divine revelation or an untimely demise. Trembling hands lifted forks to mouths while nervous laughter erupted in the ranks of the court. You could almost hear the whispered prayers. Please let it be sugar. Please let it be sugar. And then, the climactic moment. Giovanni, with a glimmer of bravado, scoops a lavish portion of the pudding and takes a monumental bite, followed by a silence that could have drowned a rat. Time itself pressed down upon the court. Visible tension was a tangible entity. One lady's veil slipped as she fainted. A courtier's wheezy expression seemed to outlast the pudding himself. Everyone held their breath, praying to their respective gods for a miracle, or for the quick return of the Duke's taste in life. Finally, Giovanni's face morphed from anticipation to bewilderment. He shook his head, cleared his throat, and bellowed, This is not what I ordered." It turned out that the Duke's private chef, acting on his best instincts or perhaps under undue influence, confused chocolate with lentils. Because who knows the difference when you live in the 15th century? A collective sigh echoed through the room as tension burst into laughter. The Duke wasn't poisoned. He was simply disappointed. He lived to drink non-lethal wine and scold chefs another day. The cook, however, did not fare as well. A dangerous mix of vengeance and dietary restrictions left him lingering in the dungeon until the next feast. In the end, not all dining hazards involve your typical betrayal. Sometimes it's just bad luck or culinary miscommunication. And while the cold comforts of trust seldom came for a duke, it's vital to feast wisely. So what's the lesson here? Trust your food processor more than your cook. And if guests look like they might pull a knife, well, maybe serve takeout. Brace yourselves, for we travel back to the year of our Lord 1365 in a murky tavern saturated with the aroma of sweat, stale ale, and dreams dashed against the cobblestones. The clientele? A melting pot of poorly paid apprentices, scheming mercenaries, and one particularly desperate assassin sporting a questionable mustache. He's here to secure a career that might involve stabbing someone, ideally not his potential employer. The atmosphere is dimly lit by flickering tallow candles, casting ominous shadows that seem to dance as if mocking the interviewee's prospects. The tables are sticky, and the sound of drunken laughter and an occasional fight over a game of dice punctuates the otherwise bleak setting. The food at the center of all this? A suspiciously large trencher of gruel, the medieval version of a really regrettable life choice. Gruel. The food of champions, if those champions were entirely unfunded and just lost an arm in battle. It was the perfect metaphor for a life of an assassin awaiting an interview. After all, this culinary delight was known to cause not just indigestion, but also existential crises. Perfect for a job where the only references you had were likely to be on a hit list. As our prospective assassin nervously shifted in his seat, he was suddenly haunted by the whispers of the interview process. Job postings for assassins were surprisingly common, often written in code just in case the local authorities cracked down. Seeking skilled knife wielder. Must have references, but not the kind that would land you in jail. Preferably those who have encountered a singing lead guitarist the night before on the job. The assassin rubbed the back of his neck, remembering his last employer, who met an unfortunate fate involving a rogue pigeon and a large vat of boiling oil. Not the strongest reference on his resume, which at this point read like a comedy of errors. Can deliver poison. Experienced in escaping through rooftops, known for erratic decision-making under pressure. Strongly suggest to only contact references who are already deceased. The tension was palpable as the interview commenced. With each of the interviewer's questions, the absurdities of medieval life ricocheted off the walls. What would your last employer say about you? He might mumble something about a tragic misunderstanding before his unexpected cheese grater incident, replied our assassin, who was now sweating in his chainmail. Then came the twist when the interviewer leaned forward, eyes glinting with dubious enthusiasm. And what's your greatest achievement? Our assassin immediately thought of the time he accidentally poisoned a banquet instead of a targeted nobleman. It had led to a delightful series of confessions that brought down half a court of corrupt officials. Unfortunately, The achievement was marred by the unfortunate branding of him as the accidental public health crisis. The interviewer's eyebrows raised as the story rolled off the assassin's tongue like a finely aged barrel of the bad ideas. In a world where failure was harvested like crops, this was good news. You mean to tell me you've taken down corruption through an unscheduled bout of food poisoning? Impressive. What motivated you? Efficiency, mostly. Also, I did it in a heroic attempt to impress a lady of the court. Brought me close to a hanging, but earned me a date, so swings and roundabouts, really. As laughter erupted in the tavern, it turned out our tragic protagonist had stumbled into an unexpected highlight. The interviewer, sensing a chaotic energy that could potentially rattle enemies, filled out the paperwork with a flourish that screamed, "I am desperate!" There, amidst gruel and ale, a new contract was forged, void of recommendations or references. Historical note: assassins were notoriously short-lived, both in careers and in body count, thanks largely to the fact that you either killed or got killed. But this cleverly stupid segment represents countless untold stories where ambition and sheer absurdity collided, leading to delightfully disastrous consequences. So remember, if your job interview involves a bowl of gruel and a dubious reputation, you may just be on the way to becoming the next big thing in medieval hiring, underscored by one simple truth. Sometimes the best reference is a history steeped in utter chaos. Prepare yourself for a chaotic romp through the economic struggles of medieval assassins. The year is 1377. Just picture it. A rickety tavern on the outskirts of Nottingham, where the walls resonate with the laughter of peasants and conspirators alike, all fueled by the aroma of stale mead and suspiciously questionable mutton. As the camera swoops over fellowship-filled tables, you can hear the bustling noise of clinking tankards, raising cheers to stolen coins and plotted betrayals. In the corner, we find our key players. Edgar the reluctant assassin, a man whose aspirations of climbing the social ladder take a nosedive as reality sinks in deeper than a pitchfork in the mud. Edgar has a plan. But first, dinner. Before lopping off heads, nothing says empire building like a strangely prepared dish of pudding comprised mainly of what can only be described as leftover anything, and a very misguided sense of culinary adventure. Enter the tavern's cook, Bertie the Bumbling, who stirs mystery into every pot and shares a mutual enchantment for surprise ingredients, namely boiled leather and day-old bread. As Edgar examines his meal, grimacing at the wet, floppy mess slathered in what appears to be molten London Bridge, the other assassins around him discuss the economy like they're plotting the next royal murder. "Listen up," one whispers, eyeing the waiter like he's a spy in a cloak. "These taxes are killing our margins. Who knew killing for a living would be so financially strapped?" Edgar grimaces harder at the pudding as he contemplates the irony of a profession entirely based on death in which he's still unable to afford a decent codpiece. As the conversation grows heated, rumors of an impending tax increase draw out the oddest culinary superstitions of the time. One assassin raises an eyebrow while inhaling the pudding's musk, proclaiming it a ruse from a cursed onion he had once encountered on a heist. One whiff of that foul beast, and poof, my life became a dreadful cobbler's horror. The others chime in with their own experiences of déjà vu and misfortune, invoking a bizarre set of procedures for purification through food, a fascinating mix of rituals, such as sacrificing a dried turnip to the patron saint of lost wages or reciting incantations while tying knots in their napkins. Inevitably, Edgar realizes that the real enemy here isn't just the tax collector, but the pudding itself, his unwitting foe that may end up being the source of his demise. As the tavern keeper stirs the cauldron near an open fire, shouting threats to wayward ale barrels, Edgar's attention returns to the pudding. Shaping like a beast, ready to pounce. Contemplating the futility of his own life choices, he embraces a grim revelation. It's not the economy that is sucking the joy out of assassination, but rather the culinary innovations of his peers. Just when it seems all hope is lost, a fellow assassin presents a bold plan. Why don't we resell our service? Put "Assassins for Hire" on a t-shirt and tap into the new marketplace. The group erupts in laughter, drowning out the squeal of a rat escaping the waft from their gruesome pudding. Instead of despair, they stumble into brainstorming the next thrilling adventure of slaying rival assassins in bizarre food-themed battles. Ultimately, they declare a revolution, freeing medieval assassins from the shackles of overpriced food and taxes through the radical economic theory of, well, doing whatever they felt like, so long as it was fueled by sheer nonsense. So what's the takeaway? Well, if you're going to rob the rich or topple a kingdom, at least do it on an empty stomach, or risk biting off more than you can chew. Enter the year 1200. The place, a dimly lit, drafty castle chamber somewhere in the heart of Central Europe. Picture it. Walls draped in the odor of mildew and a lingering scent of roasted rat. The floor? A delightfully uneven mix of straw, spilled ale, and who knows what else. Welcome to the medieval world where nuancing social interactions is as vital as putting food on your rickety table and avoiding axes to the face, unless you're into that sort of thing. Tonight's star? A secret society of assassins known as the Brotherhood of Funky Town. Not to be mistaken with other countless assassin orders who promise to cure all ills with nothing but a dagger and a poor understanding of social cues. Here, gathered in hushed tones, are the world's most awkward mercenaries, clad in oversized hoods that practically scream I'm hiding from my life choices. And what do they have to celebrate this illustrious gathering? A generous feast of distinctly underwhelming porridge and what is legally defined as mystery meat. Rumors swirl like bad gossip about the contents of this repast. Was it rat? Or merely slightly expired? Perhaps that is precisely what sends the assassins into spirals of paranoia. Every mouthful swallowed with the deliberation of a diplomat about to negotiate a treaty. Admittedly, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. The flickering candlelight only heightened the drama as if the flames too were conspiring to smolder the collective confidence of these elites. You could practically hear the heartbeat of a suspicious assassin as they ponder whether to sample the bounty at all. After all, doing so might mean unintentional entry into the Assassin Hall of Fame. Immediate demise. The first assassin, known in the group as Cloak and Dagger, flinches at the mere thought of tasting the porridge. What's in this? Could it be poisoned? He whispers. Given the custom of pointing fingers, no one grasps why he'd think that. After all, betrayal is merely a Friday night in this brotherhood. Fellow assassin Sneak and Peek chimes in about the cursed origins of the meat, recounting a tale of a pig that had mysteriously vanished only to reappear, albeit a bit less wheezy. Despite their hesitations, the porridge quickly transforms into a medicinal concoction of dread. And just as they attempt to settle their culinary qualms, the Grandmaster leaps onto a rickety table, declaring this evening's assembly an urgent matter, subtracting all potential sources of dissonance from their unsteady ranks. "It has come to my attention," he announces, "that some of our members have been, indisposed due to mysterious stomach ailments." A collective gasp ensues, as many flinch and clutch their stomachs like loyal subjects bracing for bad news. The hunt for the source becomes absurdly theatrical. Cloak and Dagger searches the hall for invisible enemy agents. Sneak and Peek suggests it's the disgruntled kitchen staff. Hushed tones erupt into full-blown accusations, especially that of a wayward servant caught in the crosshairs of overly paranoid assassins. Instead, it's finally established the meat was, by some miracle, not the sole offender. Turns out, it was the individual who unquestioningly decided to prepare this dazzling repast without a single checkup from the sanitation inspectors of doom. As the chaos reaches its zenith, dressed-up old scrolls flutter about in timely dramatic effect, revealing among all pinned notes that one fateful meal inadvertently contained carrots, something not seen since the Great Famine of 1187. And, alas, the true culprit is revealed. The tension of feeding temperamental killer wannabes, spoiled food, and a lack of inquisitive palates. Plates clattered, the remaining food scattered into metal fates, and at that moment they could all agree on one thing: assassins, glorified garbage collectors with an exaggerated resume of unexpected trauma. The lesson here? When your food could conceivably be the tipping point of rebellion, always ask, do I really want to take that dagger to the gut? Or better, just swallow my pride with a side of turnips? Ew! Not the turnips again. Picture this. The year is 1185, and we're in a dimly lit medieval tavern. The kind where the stench of unwashed peasants mingles with the slightly less appealing aroma of spilled ale and something that might once have passed for a roast. A howling storm rages outside, thunder clashing like the world's least coordinated mosh pit, while inside a round table huddles around a surprisingly cheery gang of short-tempered would-be assassins, all with a grudge against feudal authority. Their dinner? A generous helping of non-sterile boar stew, complete with bones and questionable herbs that may or may not have been foraged from the nearby witch's garden, famed for its potent enhancements. With a flick of the wrist, one assassin, let's call him Grimwald, raises his tankard, its contents sloshing perilously close to the edge, and does what any self-respecting assassin would do. He proposes a toast to the art of subtlety, while accidentally splattering stew on the tavern's furiously unamused innkeeper. As they dine, Grimwald recounts the thrill of his greatest hit: a nobleman who met an untimely demise mid-sneeze due to a fully loaded garlic crossbow. An act both subtle and spectacular in its ridiculousness. The steeds outside whinny ominously, though it's hard to tell if they sense the tension of the potential plot unraveling, or if they just really want their evening oats. Convinced that garlic-infused weaponry is the secret sauce behind an effective hit, Grimwald leans forward, eyes gleaming with paranoia as he details their latest mission to eliminate Lord Slimypants McCholesterol, a local rule who hoards cheese like it's going extinct. But cheese isn't even the half of it. Slimy Pants also had a reputation for mercilessly parodying Grimwald's death threats in the village square. The indignity. So, the crew devises a series of spectacularly silly rituals aimed at ensuring success. They firmly believed that before consuming any cheese, real or slighted, one must perform a dance. Yes, a full-on jig. Consider it the medieval version of the cha-cha, only less graceful and more prone to ending with a pulled hamstring. The group sways, dips, and twirls, amusing their fellow diners, but showcasing the lack of coordination one might expect from a band of aspiring assassins. Tension mounts as they sip on mead like it's divine nectar, using awkward humor to mask the reality that half of them could really use a sewing kit for those ill-fitting tights. And someone, probably thinking of their next piece of boar, drops from the rafters a garland of dried herbs meant to ward off ill fortune, but in turn temporarily blinds Grimwald as he spontaneously chokes on a wayward piece of bread. The evening culminates with Grimwald slipping out of the tavern under the dark cover of night, stewing over the fact that they might actually die fulfilling this mission. Though these heroes had composed a rousing ballad about their anticipated triumph, it now feels less like a heroic adventure and more like a suicide note to a cheese-loving tyrant. Just when you think things can't get worse, a deeply misguided fellow assassin attempts to blend in by dressing as a woman, forgetting that wooden shoes don't just break the mold of fashion, but also splinter the element of surprise. Ironically, while they ultimately fail their mission due to Grimwald's own over-the-top theatrics, slipping on a rogue slice of cheese and knocking down a whole banquet table of very real nobles instead, the fallout manages to elevate them into mild local fame. The crowd, entertained by the slapstick nature of their attempt, celebrates their courageous sainthood, and thus they become beloved local legends, who were never quite good at what they aimed for, but certainly found great success in pure comedic failure. The lesson here? If you're going to attempt assassination in the Middle Ages, it's wise to bring your best dance moves and a solid enough excuse for when it goes wrong. At least you'll still be known as the heroic jesters, instead of forgotten names on a long, grim list of failed hits. Welcome to the illustrious courts of medieval Europe, circa 1450. Picture a grand hall, illuminated only by flickering torches that cast dramatic shadows on the walls, making everyone look 10 pounds heavier and slightly more suspicious. The air is thick with the pungent aroma of overcooked cabbage, and the whispers of courtiers plotting their next scandal over goblets of something vaguely trustworthy. In the middle of this chaotic buffet for the senses stands Sir Edward, previously a humble knight but now a local hero. Armed with nothing but a tunic that's seen better days and a smirk that says he knows more than he should, he has recently taken a detour from merrily jousting at festivals to a much more glamorous role, that of an assassin. Because, honestly, who wouldn't want to trade their shiny armor for a life on the edge of another man's sword? Enter the court feast, a lavish display of protein, bread, and definitely not poison. The cook's specialty, he claims, is roasted swan, seasoned with just the right amount of betrayal. As the chefs parade the grotesque yet oddly appetizing dishes, our hero contemplates his career choice. One moment, you're the celebrated champion of the local tournament. The next, you're elbow-deep in a political meat grinder, trying to figure out if your next assassination should come with a side of grits or just straight-up deceit. But there's tension in the air. palpable and thick, like the gravy slowly congealing on the Lord's plate. You see, brooding conspiracies often come with dinner in medieval times. To spice things up, there are superstitions surrounding food that read like culinary horror stories. Did you know that some chefs sprinkled rat hairs onto meat pies to ward off evil spirits? Or that brushing your teeth with a garlic clove before service was definitely a thing, both for freshness and to deter unwanted suitors? Talk about oral hygiene with a touch of chaos. As the feast reaches its zenith, Sir Edward receives an urgent note. Apparently, it's impossible to savor a nice dish without the looming threat of mortal danger. You see, our darling Edward is supposed to remove a rival noble that night. No pressure. Seconds before he makes his move, he watches a fellow knight press his nose into a bowl of stew and then faint, convinced he'd been cursed by a jealous witch. Realizing this whole food affair could be his undoing, Edward starts having second thoughts about the whole assassin gig. Plus, those swans might be a bit too beautiful to roast. Just as Edward is about to decide whether to withdraw his lethal contract or just double down with an extra helping of bellyache, the cook trips and sets the entire table ablaze. Chaos ensues. People scream, twirl their hair, and leap over nuances of culinary fire as the flames engulf the roast ducks, circling them in a spectacle of hellish irony. Edward, still thinking his cue has come, makes his way through the panic and confusion, only to find, surprise, the swan was already stale, and it drops with a splat from its royal perch right onto the lap of none other than the very lord he was supposed to assassinate. In a twist of fate that no bard could have foretold, the lord is too busy laughing at his unfortunate poultry predicament to notice his would-be assassin scrambling to disappear in the throngs of cackling guests. Edward walks away, not as the feared assassin he planned to be, but rather as the knight who learned that henpecking overtakes hunting when it comes to the nobleman's banquet. And what lesson can we relay from this feathery fiasco? Always check the menu before committing to dinner. It might just save your career, especially if you find roast swan and medieval politics on the same plate. Welcome to the 14th century, a time when if you weren't busy hiding your true intentions with a hearty smile, you were likely plotting with daggers behind your back. The place? An illustrious, candle-drenched banquet hall reminiscent of a game of hungry hippos, where everyone is both starving and desperately seeking to avoid a lethal buffet. The air is tantalizingly thick with the robust aromas of roasted meats, spiced wines, and the distinct scent of underlying doom as the court of Duke Rogan gathers for a lavish feast. Among the guests are a gaggle of nobles sporting gilded attire and nervous glances. Enter our protagonist, Sir Nefarious of Badluck, the court's supposed top assassin, known more for his half-baked plans than his hitting prowess. Tonight's special? A mysterious dish known as potage à la poisson, a culinary delight that might send the faint of heart straight into an early grave. As the bubbling pot on the side screams of dubious ingredients, the knights make light of the feast, but secretly wonder if they'll actually survive the evening. After all, the cherished decor isn't just the embroidered tapestries, it's a trophy wall of past cooks who were just a taste away from being cut down by failed recipes. Sir Nefarious attempts to pour a gleeful goblet of wine while keeping half an eye on the suspicious kitchen staff, a bunch of cooks huddled in a darkened corner, whispering about the secrets held within the pottage. In medieval banquet tradition, food and fortune were intertwined, as evidenced by the bizarre rituals that accompanied every feast. The medieval menu came heavily dosed with superstition. The chef, quite amusingly, needed to chant to the salt before using it because, of course, a pinch of bad juju could lead to a pinch of poison. Guests would touch their food whilst invoking a deity of their choosing, just in case Loki himself decided to join for dessert. Yet, as the first spoonful of pottage inched towards Sir Nefarious' mouth, tension rose faster than a baker's yeast at a 100-degree oven. As he lowered the spoon, a boy runs in, the cousin of a disgraced noble who had a history of mischief and misfires. He shrieks, "My lords!" The pottage may be infested with, and for a dramatic pause, the tension chokes the room. Cabbage. Gasps echoed through the hall, as if someone had yelled treason in the midst of a royal wedding. Cabbage was actually the villain of many meals, known for announcing itself in an obnoxious manner and potentially ruining the best-laid plans of any assassin. Sir Nefarious drops his spoon, clenching his breastplate as if the revelation had pierced him. As nobles flailed wildly, visions of unpleasant digestion danced in their heads. Their practical survival instincts kicked in, leading to a melee where each noble scrambled to protect their dignity and their digestive systems. Someone declared, "This is treason against our ribs," while another noble reached for the nearest bread roll as a defensive weapon. Fluffy loaves flew through the air like daggers, hit the nearest guards on the head, who then facetiously declared themselves under assault. In the chaos, successively better cooks were blamed, lawsuits initiated, and the kitchen staff promptly beheaded. The real irony? It turned out the pottage was just a mix of grains and backstory. The cabbage had been loyal to its roots, lingering peacefully and defensively all along. As guests were escorted out, Sir Nefarious slumped back in his chair, food still untouched. Tonight had not just been an assassination attempt gone wrong, it was a food fight that could stir the upstart prediction of social warfare among the lords who would now reconsider every dining invitation with sobering urgency. So, if history has taught us anything, it's this. Always taste your pottage before planning an assassination, or you might end up being the one served, along with an extra side of chaos. Amidst the heart-wrenching clang of dueling swords in the 14th century, there lies a much less glamorous occupation, the life of an assassin. Welcome to the thriving metropolis of Nottinghamshire, a place where the letters of the alphabet get tangled up and silence is more golden than gold itself. Picture this. It's dusk, and the fading sun casts a warm glow over fields dotted with sheep, while the overbearing aroma of wet hay mingles with an inexplicable smell of something suspiciously burnt. Enter our protagonist, a humble assassin named Reginald, with more aspirations than sense and a dream of nobility yet to be accomplished. Unfortunately, the only two things that stood between him and said dream? His complete lack of competence and a never-ending queue of dubious clients willing to pay him in actual beans to take down rivals and inconveniences alike. For Reginald, the job perks were much less about the thrill of the hunt and far more about the freedom to simply be ignored. No one noticed you lurking in the shadows, which was great because avoiding awkward small talk was a skill worth honing. On this notable evening, Reginald was set to carry out his latest contract during a feast thrown by the illustrious Lord Bickerington. The clinking of silverware and the incessant laughter from the crowded banquet hall above echoed ominously, creating a cacophony that could almost drown out the sound of Reginald's self-pity as he scraped through the mud to find a way in. As the sun set and the oil lamps flickered to life, the intoxicating combination of overcooked venison and roasted turnips wafted into the air, wrapping around him like a thick, healing blanket against the chill of inevitability. But Reginald's true mission wasn't merely to avenge a petty feud. No, that would be too straightforward. Instead, he was here to steal a secret recipe for Lord Bickerington's famous turnip pie, which was rumored to feature an ingredient so exotic it was capable of getting past the taste buds of even the most discerning palate: ignominy. As he peered through the crack in the door to the kitchen, a scene unfolded that would make even the most jaded assassin lose their appetite. The cooks were bonkers, half of them fighting over the last scraps of pie crust like ravenous beasts, while the other half debated whether using a dash of nutmeg could summon the spirit of the previous food taster, who had once met an unfortunate end under a table piled high with parsnips. Amidst all this delicious insanity, Reginald could slip away unnoticed, as cooks tended to have the shortest of attentiveness spans, perfect for an assassin such as himself. But just as he was about to leap into action, chaos erupted. A pompous squire, who seemed to have mistaken his boisterous laughter for a complimentary instrument played far too loudly, fell face first into the awaiting venison. Instead of the kitchen erupting into screams, though, laughter prevailed. The cooks guffawed, and Reginald was momentarily left wondering if his exit would simply lead them to believe he was part of some medieval prank. Lifting a hefty pie straight out of the cooling rack, possibly the actual target of his quest, he prepared to bolt. But just then, a weary-eyed servant stumbled through the door holding what appeared to be a long-lost legume from Lord Bickerington's garden, further stoking chaos in the kitchen. In the ensuing distraction, Reginald swiftly wobbled out with that innocent-looking pastry in hand, striking his escape like a ghost at sunrise. In the end, instead of bringing down his nemesis, Reginald only succeeded in becoming the unfortunate subject of a pie-eating contest that the town would be talking about for years. Yes, the assassin went from making an impact to making a casserole, becoming the laughingstock of Nottinghamshire, where they ironically honored him as their unofficial pie champion. So, what do we learn? Sometimes the most delicious victories are the ones you stumble upon while everyone's too busy being oblivious to notice you're not even supposed to be there. Picture this. The year is 1475. And we find ourselves in a dimly lit workshop, nestled deep within the dank underbelly of Florence. The air is thick with the stink of aged goat leather, spilled ink, and the faintest whiff of musk, courtesy of several frustrated would-be assassins who are working under the relentless pressure of their patriarchal overseers. Tacked on a wall are scrawled-out blueprints of impossibly complex killing devices, and in the background, the urgent clink of swords being sharpened echoes ominously. Enter our heroine, Bianca, a daring woman determined to break the glass ceiling of this brutal, blood-soaked profession. Dressed in an ill-fitting tunic and armed with a dagger that has seen more action than its owner, she resembles less an assassin and more a confused seamstress who accidentally wandered into the murder business. The centerpiece of this tale? a celebratory dinner in honor of the apprentice's deadly skills. Tonight's menu features a medieval delicacy, roasted peacock. Yes, that's right, because feasting upon an extravagant bird painted in gold leaf is how medieval society showcased their culinary expertise and their ability to make a fashion statement all at once. If a peacock could be served on a platter, you knew they were not just aiming to satisfy hunger, but rather to send a message about wealth and influence, while simultaneously meet aspiring to keep their head attached to their bodies. But in a world dominated by men sharpening their swords and their egos, Bianca faced an uphill battle. As the male assassins prepped their covert plans involving grappling hooks and elaborate disguises, Bianca's task was to bring the peacock, a feat as implausible as her desire for respect. The male apprentices conspired, their discussions dripping with crude humor as they sat around their flickering torches, blithely shaking off any notion that someone with a uterus could slice a throat with any prowess. And then came the tension. A peacock was not just a bird. It was a symbol of ambition, envy, and heaven forbid a chance for a woman to be recognized in their cutthroat society. Unbeknownst to Bianca, her adversary, the brutishly charming Lorenzo, was convinced she could never accomplish the task. He made it his mission to sabotage her. "You'll never get it," he taunted, twirling a dagger and sporting a smirk that shouted, "I live in my mother's basement while crafting my future in villainy." A host of nonsensical, strangely medieval superstitions started brewing among the men. If the peacock does not serve its purpose, they all believed, a curse would descend, making everyone involved fumble every assassination attempt henceforth. The mere thought sent anxious shivers through the assembled crowd, further elevating the stakes. The absurdity of it frayed the nerves. Lorenzo, struggling to cut strings while trying to balance a gallon of henbane just in case, managed to horrify everyone with his choice of a side dish: roast turnips. The great peacock heist will fizzle into a roast turnip disaster. They guffawed. Just then, a series of unfortunate events unfolded. Bianca, holding the peacock, slipped on an errant turnip peel and, as if summoned by the heavens, launched the plumed beast high into the air. Time froze. The peacock gracefully soared before crashing directly on the head of Lorenzo. While the men's murmurs turned into uproarious laughter, shattering their prudish elitism, Bianca seized the moment. "There, see? Turns out women can drop birds on heads and land them right on target." It marked the first victory for a woman assassin, turning the tide against years of male-dominated folly. In that moment, with the gorgeous and embarrassed peacock somewhat still regal on Lorenzo's head, the room began to why-speak in unison. This evening, we toast to the feast and the failures that taught us how to deal with the hard, pecking truths of life. So what did we learn? Women might take a back seat in medieval politics, but when it comes to assassinations, sometimes you need a little feather to ruffle the competition. Picture this. The year is 1327, and we're not on a thrilling adventure of grand nightly battles or dark, brooding dungeons. No, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves stranded in the musty backroom of a dimly lit medieval bureaucracy office, a realm so void of excitement it could suck the joy out of a jester's prank. The air thick with dust, the smell of mildew mingling with the faint aroma of stale parchment. It's enough to make even the most resilient of bureaucrats cringe. Amidst piles of invoices and a fortress of paperwork, we meet our protagonists. John the Inept, the newly hired scribe, barely old enough to look over the desk, and Lady Gertrude the Grueling, the head bureaucratic overlord infamous for her iron grip on ink quills and more paperwork than a modern bank. Their task today? To process the overflow of requests for, drum roll please, horse tax exemptions. Yes, because the number of horses one owns deserved unendurable scrutiny among a population that could hardly keep track of its own shires. Now, you might be sitting there thinking it couldn't get worse. But wait, this isn't just any paperwork. Oh no, this is medieval bureaucracy. Here, forms had to be filled out in triplicate, requiring not just ink, but blessings from a parish priest, approval from the local lord, and possibly an interpretive dance by a bard. Literally, to ensure the accuracy of your horse tax exemption, you might have to ponce around with a lute while prancing. As the day wears on, the atmosphere thickens with tension. John, after accidentally spilling a jug of ink on the petition of a rogue nobleman, now finds himself in a predicament only best suited for an ill-fated sitcom. The nobleman, a character so drama-filled he could earn a spot on a reality show, starts believing the ink spill is a direct violation of royal decree, perhaps an assassination attempt on his very reputation. Yes, he thinks it was either a calculated attack or an omen sent by the constellations that warned him to stop wearing tights. Meanwhile, the chattering of quills becomes melting pot of frenetic energy. Each ink-dipped feather must be triple-checked against records older than the notion of personal privacy. Footsteps echo with the sound of deadlines approaching faster than a charging knight, and the ever-present fear that someone might get a letter wrongly delivered to an assassin instead of a baker. Because, of course, miscommunication could lead to someone getting killed, or worse, the delivery of slightly burnt bread. Just when it seemed like John might found the strength to establish an organized system of filing, calamity strikes. Lady Gertrude, now caught up in an inspired paper-shredding frenzy seriously, she thought she could solve everything with her trusty scissor, accidentally decimates an entire batch of horse tax exemption requests. The scream of despair reverberates through the room like a horn announcing an approaching enemy. All of a sudden, there's a swarm of the community members outside, armed with pitchforks, demanding their rightful exemption. Amidst the chaos, a messenger runs in, covered in mud and probably a few stray horsehairs, clutching a declaration from the king insisting that all tax paperwork be submitted by noon. It was an ironic twist of fate that leaves both John and Gertrude utterly dumbfounded. How could they process the paperwork when the king's indecipherable decree had gotten lost in its own bureaucratic limbo? At this moment, a rather astute historian points out the absurdity stemming from recurrent medieval bureaucracy. Instead of wielding swords and daggers, they were wielding pens and ink pots, silently lobbying for survival behind layers of parchment. An unimaginable irony, where taxes and ink can lead to more bloodshed than any open battlefield. So here's the ultimate takeaway, folks. In the medieval world, it turns out paperwork kills just as effectively as any dagger. The lesson? Always be careful how you wield your quill, or you might just slay the entire town's chances of keeping their horses. Or at least have to face a mob that prefers pitchforks over paperwork. In a thrilling night filled with uneasy alliances and questionable dinner choices, we find ourselves in the year 1255, in a smoke-filled back room of a tavern so dank it had its own ecosystem. The place reeked of unwashed feet, badly brewed ale, and the faint whisper of betrayal. The stage is set for our protagonist, Sir Mortimer the Shifty, a medieval assassin with the charisma of a flat tire and a track record of kitchen failures that could fill a barrel of bad wine. He squints suspiciously at a plate of what can only be described as the aftermath of a food fight at a pig farm, where the featured dish is a suspiciously jiggly slab of aspic, a delicacy of cold gelatin with pieces of who-knows-what swirling inside. The secret ingredient? Probably panic. As Mortimer prepares for his potentially last gamble of the evening, patrons murmur about the tension rising in the air. Was it the aspic or the deadly agenda of the neighboring lord? Either way, danger lurked around every corner, and, in this case, behind every gelatinous bite. The tavern bustles with the sounds of raucous laughter, clinking mugs, and the unmistakable creaking of wooden benches that probably housed more secrets than patrons. A nearby bard strums a catchy tavern tune, blissfully unaware that his next song could be a dirge. Meanwhile, Mortimer's head spins at the thought of becoming a main ingredient in a historic stew. He wouldn't put it past the villainous Lord Balthazar, who had a penchant for making examples out of less-than-loyal assassins. As our assassin sits down to have his first bite of the questionable aspic, a ritual intense enough to rival a dragon's dance begins. For you see, each assassin was equipped with a unique superstition about food. Mortimer believed that if he ate a meal prepared with a cursed spatula, he would guarantee his head on a pike. His companion, Dame Weaselin, insisted that her safety depended on her forehead being adorned with a food-based charm. In this case, nothing less than a pie made from the last batch of overripe apples. Before Mortimer could even take a bite of his potential death sentence, a scuffle broke out nearby. Someone had drunkenly spilled ale, and the chaotic aftermath resembled a disaster zone, mirroring the chaos in Mortimer's mind. In a panic, Mortimer grabbed the plate of aspic, leading to a slapstick sequence of pratfalls and spilled drinks that even the most seasoned jester would struggle to replicate. Everyone awkwardly ducked, weaved, and wrestled over the slippery tiles for a taste of freedom. But then, in a twist worthy of a Shakespearean farce, as Mortimer made his escape, the chaos surrounding the unfortunate spilling served as a perfect disguise. Everyone in the tavern turned their attention to the brawl, thus providing the assassins with a marvelous, albeit sticky, escape route. They slipped right out the door, while some poor soul was wrestling with a particularly rebellious haggis. Outside, fresh air greeted Mortimer and Dame Weaselin like a long-lost friend, and they embraced it with the fervor of people who had narrowly avoided becoming gelatinous appetizers. In a silent moment, they made a pact, never to trust a food that's more wobbly than their conscience. As history remembers it, this runaway escapade went down as legendary, becoming the stuff of tavern gossip and fabrication, where tales of knights narrowly escaping gelatinous doom transformed instead into heroic ballads sung in celebration of bravery. And the lesson here? When faced with perilous culinary choices, remember, never underestimate the power of a good brawl over dinner, because who needs an assassin's blade when you've got the unintentional slapstick of a tavern full of drunken fools? In the year of our Lord, 1187, somewhere in the muddy, pestilent backwoods of England, We find ourselves at the esteemed Bounty Hunter Academy, open to any aspiring rogue with a penchant for incompetence and a slight overestimation of their own abilities. The air is thick with the scent of wet hay, muddy boots, and the unmistakable aroma of burnt cheese from the lunchroom, which would become the setting for our tale. The scene is set. A makeshift classroom constructed of rotting timber where a grizzled instructor, a one-eyed former assassin who went by the name Knick-Knack, presides over a group of young hopefuls who are practicing their stealth techniques. Each of these aspiring bounty hunters is a shining example of mediocrity. There's Bert, who trips over his own sword, and Eliza, who thinks hiding behind a bush means making herself a walking bush. It's not convincing. And let's not forget gullible Greg, who is currently trying to be stealthy while announcing his grand strategy out loud, thinking the key to stealth is confidence. Remember, students, Knick-Knack rasps, spitting out half a piece of cheese from his last meal. It's not just about sneaking up on your target. You also have to blend in, be inconspicuous, like a shadow. Eliza nods vigorously, a little too vigorous. She ends up knocking over a barrel, causing it to roll into Bert, who, surprised, drops his sword and nearly cuts off his own foot trying to regain balance. As this scene unfolds, the room echoes with the sounds of fantasy combat mishaps, clanging pots, screeches of panic, and the barely audible sound of Greg still trying to explain his plan. The food of this jolly gathering is an unidentifiable slop that they're supposed to identify as gruel, but smells suspiciously like a sock left over from the last century. As the decorum crumbles, so does the food, with splatters of it decorating the academy's walls, providing a rich tapestry of culinary depravity. Amidst the chaos, Knick-Knack draws attention to the gruel, explaining its significance. You must always be prepared to eat in the field. And remember, the first rule of survival is to always be suspicious of your food. Did it come from the local pig, or was it the pig's revenge? His point is punctuated by the loud exclamation from Greg, who just discovered the gruel contains a frog. "Look, it's a delicacy," he shouts, holding it up as if it were a prized possession. The tension mounts as the students debate whether they should be gathering bounty or foraging for better quality food. Eliza suggests trying to bribe the local baker for something, anything that doesn't resemble swamp refuse. Greg, however, counters with a master plan to sneak out in pairs to steal leftover pies and desserts from unsuspecting villagers, forgetting that these peculiar actions would never go unnoticed by the vigilant townsfolk. Suddenly, as if summoned by the chaos of the gruel crisis, the local baker, Mrs. Pumpernickel, happens to wander in, carrying bags of her still-warm bread and shouting, "Get back! Give me that frog!" This unexpected twist sends the would-be bounty hunters scrambling, having completely forgotten their initial mission in favor of chasing after fresh-baked goods. Who could blame them? Pumpernickel's pastries would forever be the thing dreams are made of, unlike the murky mess in their bowls. Long story short, by the end of it all, Mrs. Pumpernickel ends up distributing bread to the students, providing more sustenance than the instructors ever could, while Knick-Knack silently weeps into his remains of gruel. For the hopes of his former profession have now been reduced to a pies-crounging race. It's no wonder that medieval bounty hunters had a daunting reputation. They trained with gruel, chased bread, and notoriously lacked knowledge of stealth entirely. Lesson learned? Whether in academia or actual bounty hunting, always carry a snack. because the last thing you want to do is get lost in the woods looking for targets when all you can think about is how to mash a frog into a sandwich. Imagine this: a candle-lit banquet, somewhere in the 14th century, vast enough to seat a collection of nobles whose only skill was backstabbing, both literally and figuratively. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meats, but even more pungent was the simultaneous waft of betrayal and mistrust, like a medieval cologne that no gentleman would admit to wearing. Now, enter stage left: Roland, an assassin of questionable competence who couldn't tell the difference between a poison and a packet of salt. He was invited to the feast under the mistaken impression that he would be meeting conquering heroes and not mere princes frequently sieving poison into pastries. For Roland, that night would either be a whiskey-soaked legendary tale or a blundersome journey toward an early demise. As the banquet commenced, laughter echoed off the stone walls, though a touch of coughs disguised laughter, and whispers blended seamlessly into the clinking of tankards. Things swiftly went downhill when the appetizers arrived. Exotic delicacies prepared with the utmost caution and absolute paranoia. First course: a raw fish called the Envoy of the Sea, served on a plate so ornate it must have been plundered from the royal jewels. The host, Count Ricardo, in an ill-fated attempt to impress, reordered the menu after claims of seafood poisoning during last week's feast. The atmosphere grew heavier than an apothecary's jar of lead, as every noble's eyes darted towards their neighbors, checking for signs of food poisoning panic. So absurd it was more of a comedy than a cautionary tale. With every raise of the goblet, every gulp, trepidation brewed. It became a bizarre ritual. After each course, a group of eager nobles would offer a public toast to the dangers of back-alley assassination tactics, while the food taster quietly panicked in the corner, pondering life decisions that made him the willful martyr of this buffet of horror. It was as if they were daring fate. Come, death. Holler from the kitchen. Take a big bite. Then, the pièce de résistance. The roasted pig, golden and glistening, which everyone knew was a direct descendant of the local lord's favorite pet. As the steam wafted from the crispy skin, noblemen's eyes glimmered with the thrill of anticipation, proving that nostalgia could draw a crowd as effectively as fear. Roland, however, had other plans. He had a target. But just as he was about to plunge his dagger into the pig, Count Ricardo stood and gave a sinister toast, a shocking twist no one saw coming. He announced his intention to bury the hatchet and declare his support for the ascendant Laird of Lard, a historic rival. Cue the outrage. In a chaotic twist resembling a scene from a farcical play, nobles began yelling and tossing their plates across the table. The pig's fate hung in the balance as everyone vied for their pieces. No knife or fork in hand, just swords waving haphazardly through the air like poorly choreographed dancers at a drunken ball. During the ruckus, Roland found himself ensnared amongst the flying dishes, realizing he was the only one not partaking in this culinary calamity while clutching a tiny fork, ready for a swift assassination. However, his target had whisked away, likely seeking safety under the dinner table, next to another noble smart enough to hoard the winning piece of the pig. What remained was a battlefield littered with half-eaten fish, tankards, and the reeking remnants of insulted culinary aspirations. Finally, the brave chef emerged from the kitchen. faced the overturned banquet, and called the nobles subhuman creatures with no respect for dinner. He raised a ladle high to proclaim the dish had in fact been exquisite but was utterly ruined by raucous folly. Despite the pandemonium, a silent agreement formed. They collectively decided to blame it on the one who's always late. They all knew him, but no one would sign the stack of parchment. Roland, meanwhile, mumbled a half-hearted toast to the future, clutching his now soggy fork for dear life. So what's the takeaway from all this grand farce? Being an assassin isn't just about wielding daggers. It's also about dodging bad food and worse company. Remember, always check the guest list before crashing the next banquet, lest you wind up at a party where it really sucks to be the assassin. In an age defined not only by plagues, but also by misplaced loyalties, we find ourselves in the year 1356, deep within the shadows of a secretive castle in the heart of England. Candlelight flickers ominously as a raven, who has apparently mistaken the battlements for a comedy club, squawks nearby, impatiently awaiting the main act. The poorly coordinated dinner of the Kinsley family, the original medieval assassination dynasty. Tonight's meal? An extravagant pheasant, served with all the pomp and circumstance of an execution. The table is set with mismatched goblets, likely scavenged from various battlefields. The overwhelming aroma of roast bird wafts through the drafty hall, mingling with the lingering stench of eavesdropping and whispered conspiracies. In this particular family, a night of feasting often comes with a side of family distrust, frequently leading to unexpected fatalities, whether by poison or lead projectile. In the center of the table sits Reginald Kinsley, the family patriarch, fresh from his most recent betrayal. This time his cousin Bertie, who was presumed slightly too ambitious regarding the family's fortune. The family has gathered for its annual award ceremony, most likely to be stabbed in the back. So, dinner conversations are less about politics and more about who might be working with the neighboring baron. As the pheasant is served, traditions kick in. Each family member must recite a family mantra before taking a bite. The mantra in question? Loyalty is thicker than blood, unless it's the blood of a traitor. The room erupts in laughter, but it's this feeling of levity that's most dangerous as swords are sharpened. Metaphorically, of course. The food is placed under the careful surveillance of the family's fool, Jester Joffrey, who looks as panicked as someone serving spaghetti on a game show where the answer is death. But the tension mounts as Reginald recalls his many enemies. Rumor has it that Cousin Edna has taken up knitting, and she's only one ball of yarn away from knitting an assassination trap. While clinking goblets, she mentions her special recipe for sauce. A hint of something suspicious flits through the air, likely a combination of hidden spices and betrayal. Reginald's eyes dart around as if every other cousin is potential fodder for his next deed. What if the distasteful sauce actually is poisoned? Not to mention the infamous family legacy of using food as both sustenance and deception. Perfectly poisoned pies, deadly dessert, and a roast with a hidden compartment for darts. An ill-fated toast is raised to honor family loyalty, only for the phantasm of mistrust to surface, sending platters flying and accusations soaring. "You've definitely laced my peas with arsenic," declares Edna, after tasting them with all the discernment of a taste-testing frog. Joffrey attempts to intervene only to get hit in the head with a serving spoon, flinging mashed potatoes everywhere, an alternate weapon of choice, apparently. Finally, the revelation dawns. It's simply gravy. Who even has the audacity to gripe about gravy? Reginald proclaims, looking baffled, as the family erupts into uproarious laughter, dropping their knives and temporarily overlooking their penchant for family dysfunction. But in a plot twist only akin to a terrible soap opera, Cousin Mortimer casually mentions he forgot to mention that the gravy was indeed made from last week's stew. And what was simmering in that stew? Well, that turned out to be an unfortunate neighbor, rumored to have been involved in a juicy love affair. And thus, tensions dissolve like poorly baked bread. Yet another dinner ends in chaos rather than murder, or maybe just a very hearty family misunderstanding. And the Kinsley family learned one irrefutable lesson. It really doesn't get better than food and family until someone brings up a grudge from Thanksgiving. So what's the moral of the story? Always taste test your relatives before dinner, because loyalty might just be the most deadly ingredient on the table. Enter the bustling world of the 12th century. Picture it, a shadowy tavern tucked away in the dank alleys of a medieval city, where the ale flows as freely as the rumors. We can smell the stale bread, hear the off-key jabbering of locals, and feel the palpable tension thicker than the fog rolling in off the nearby marsh. Welcome to the Quivering Goblet, where today's menu features a delightful array of, well, we'll get to that. As the candlelight flickers against the grimy walls, let's meet our esteemed patron, Roger the Wrangling Whisker, a lesser-known assassin with aspirations larger than his stature. Roger's idea of an average day involves meticulously plotting out his next assassination while dodging the occasional turkey leg hurled by disgruntled guests who can't quite handle their mead. Little known to many, his most important job is simply staying invisible, not in the ethereal sense, but rather due to the society he operates in. Assassins were either glorified or vilified, yet purely invisible when it came to historical documentation. Tonight's gastronomic delight? A noble feast of none other than swill stew served in bowls that have seen better days. The aroma is oddly comforting, perhaps a mix of overcooked cabbage, the faint whiff of mold, and a spice blend that is best left unmentioned. Take a gander at the ingredients. Remnants of whatever last week's roadkill was. Truly, the stuff of dignitaries. As Roger huddles in a corner, the tavern erupts into a cacophony of medieval rituals, unfounded superstitions making the meal feel like an audition for Who Wants to Be a Pioneer of Poisoning. One patron solemnly swears that failing to chant the names of 3 old kings while simultaneously spitting in the stew will invoke the spirit of an assassin long lost to history. And trust us, forgetfulness could mean grave consequences for your pallor. Amidst the ruckus, Roger ponders. If only he could find a better trade. Perhaps the care and feeding of starving ferrets could be a more stable gig. Just as he's about to lean into that aspiration, a commotion arises as a potato rolls off a wooden crate, creating a domino effect that sends an assortment of failed pastries crashing down. Alarms are red. The meal has been desecrated, and so has the mood. In a show of dazzling proactive ineptitude, bartenders rush to clean the mess, while patrons clamor in horror as if a dragon has landed in their midst. Roger decides to seize the moment with the tact of a seasoned assassin, attempting to slip away unnoticed. But alas, life is not a video game where one simply walks 2 steps away and disappears into thin air. No, he stumbles over the roots of an errant vine, and with that display of grace, he knocks over a barrel of ale. The explosion of froth floods the room. Amid roars of laughter and charges for the nearest bucket, Roger stands drenched and defeated. Meanwhile, what was to be the tale of an elusive killer now becomes an anecdote for the ages. That time, Roger the Invisible Assassins accidentally redefined Splash Zone during Stew Night. Fast forward to modern history. While tales of knights and legendary battles are preserved in the annals of time, the invisible assassins like Roger are not even footnotes. The irony? They were masters of disguise, but not of documentation. So, what's the takeaway? Just remember, folks, to be a medieval assassin was a slippery enterprise, especially when your greatest weapon against history is a precarious patch of ale-slicked floor. The year, 1453. The place, a dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of a medieval kingdom, where whispers of treachery hang in the air like smoke from the damp oak beams. The scent, a dizzying concoction of spilled ale, raw onions, and the musk of disgruntled peasants who just learned that their woodcutting contracts didn't cover mysterious axe accidents. Enter Lord Wimpleton III, the most extravagant lord of the valley, wearing a feathered hat that could make a peacock jealous, and an outfit that was more fabric than person. He needed a contract to hire his own personal assassin, a detail that might seem excessive to modern eyes, but was as routine as a medieval knight bragging about his latest jousting victory. His plan? To eliminate a rival noble in a way that wouldn't backfire into his own badly stained tapestry. The court was filled with assorted characters, including his lawyer, a twitchy fellow named Barnaby, whose legal knowledge was only marginally better than his ability to avoid stepping onto the lord's ornate cloak. The room buzzed with sounds. The clinking of goblets, the ominous creak of wooden chairs, and the occasional melodious cry of a passing chicken. Was it a spy, or just dinner? As they drafted the contract, diners around them feasted on an extravagant platter of roasted swans, while young servants tried desperately to keep the floor from becoming an unintentional murder scene of flying peas and half-eaten bread rolls. In the world of contracts, food was less about sustenance and more about power plays, a method of asserting dominance or at least an awkward attempt to keep the food taster alive. But this wasn't just any meal. With every mouthful of swan, Barnaby detailed the bizarre customs attached to contracts of the time. For instance, it was customary to sprinkle the food with salt, an ancient practice that came with the superstition that it warded off evil spirits. But try explaining that to an assassin who just downed too much spiced wine and thought evil was a flavor. Hilarity ensued when the chef miscalculated the amount of salt. Suddenly, the contract was more seasoning than agreement. As the debate over clauses ensued, voices rose and pens wagged frantically. One particularly spirited argument arose when Lord Wimpleton insisted on a clause for treachery, which his lawyer promptly informed him was basically just a get-out-of-jail-free card for everyone involved. Why bother with loyalty when you can have an entire legal system operating under the assumption that treachery was just business as usual? One gulp of ale later, The assembly nearly toppled into chaos when they realized this clause would also legally place the tavern's dog, Sir Sniffsalot, into the contract as an official witness. The climax of this medieval comedy unfolded when the Lord declared, "Let us seal this contract with a final toast." As he raised his tankard, the entire tavern erupted into begrudging clinks, sorrowful cheers, and the understanding that an assassin was about to be contracted, and God save whoever that hapless fool would be. In a final twist, as the Lord and his increasingly confused entourage downed their ale, they forgot to sign the actual contract. Rather than perilously sending an assassin after someone else, they inadvertently signed a lifelong commitment to the tavern in exchange for all the ale they could drink, a contract that went on to be the most well-executed business decision of the week. As laughter echoed throughout the tavern, one couldn't help but note how contracts, not only meant to substantiate deals but routinely messed up through drunken antics, proved to be far messier than anticipated. So remember, in the medieval world of treachery, keep your contracts shorter than your hangover and longer than your understanding of basic legalese. Cue the dramatic music. The year, somewhere in the 15th century. The setting, a candlelit dining hall large enough to qualify as an echo chamber for paranoia. The air, thick with incense, political tension, and the faint whiff of undercooked goat. Enter the Sultan. Not just any Sultan, the Sultan. Absolute ruler of an empire so vast it would take 3 camels, 2 months, and a sturdy prayer to cross it. His royal court is assembled, his gold-plated spoon polished to an almost blinding sheen. Tonight's dinner, a humble bowl of lentil soup. In theory, harmless. In practice, potentially lethal. Because in the royal courts of history, soup wasn't just a starter, it was Russian roulette with chickpeas. See, back in the day, poisoning wasn't a side plot, it was a career strategy. You wanted promotion? You poisoned your boss. You wanted divorce? Poison the in-laws. You wanted to speed up succession? Put something extra in Papa's porridge. Which brings us back to the Sultan, the soup, and the impending existential crisis. The dish was prepared in the harem kitchen, a fortress of steel cauldrons, eunuch guards, and approximately 17 underpaid cooks who all lived in constant fear of sneezing in the direction of a royal plate. Everything had to pass a rigorous, slightly insane safety protocol. Step 1. The chief food taster, a man whose job description was literally first to die, would sip every dish while being watched by at least 6 scribes ready to write his obituary. Step 2. The soup was transferred into a gold-plated, pearl-inlaid, cursor-repelling bowl, just in case the poison was allergic to wealth. Step 3. The Grand Vizier's aunt's astrologer was consulted to ensure the planetary alignment wouldn't trigger invisible food demons. Step 4. Finally, the Sultan's most loyal servant would offer the soup while reciting a protective prayer that had been mistranslated so many times it now roughly meant, "May the beans be merciful." Despite all this, the minute the Sultan took a sip, a tiny sip, he frowned. The entire court froze. One guard dropped his scimitar. A musician in the back fainted into his lute. Was it too salty? Too bland? Or, the worst possibility, was it treacherous? cue the chaos. The kitchen staff was interrogated faster than a Netflix crime doc. The food taster was missing. He'd actually just gone to the latrine. Rumors spread that a rival prince had bribed the spice merchant. Someone remembered seeing a cat near the lentils. Was it an assassin cat? Meanwhile, the Sultan sat silently, swirling the soup like it held the answers to the universe. Eventually, a physician was summoned, an expert in the medieval art of diagnosing everything as imbalance of humors. He sniffed the bowl, tasted it himself, then confidently declared, "Sire, it's cumin. Just a lot of the cumin." Relieved murmurs. The lute player revived. The guards stood down. The cat was pardoned. And the soup? It was finished. Carefully, suspiciously, with a hint of lingering trauma. But the message was clear. Even soup can be suspect when your job comes with a crown and an invitation to be stabbed from 30 different directions. So what did we learn? Always taste test your broth, unless you're the Sultan. In that case, delegate, pray, and maybe order something less horrible. Picture it. The year 1356, somewhere in the depths of France, in a small, quaint village that could barely be distinguished from the meat pies being sold in the market square. Imagine the type of place where ambition goes to die, overshadowed only by the delightful aroma of freshly baked bread and the very popular, but equally delightful, rampant goat dung that decorates the cobblestones. This is where our story begins, not with a bang, but with a commoner quietly blowing his nose into a rather unimpressive piece of cloth. Meet Bertha, our not-so-typical hero, a man whose entire existence revolved around looking extraordinarily ordinary. With his frayed tunic, an acute awareness of the local gossip, and a talent for blending in that would make a chameleon weep, Bertha's greatest ambition was to avoid drawing attention. He was the quintessential nobody in a world that needed everyone to be someone. But lurking beneath his humble demeanor was a secret. Bertha was an assassin. Yes, he envisioned a life of mischief and blades, but reality dictated that he must first master the art of being completely mundane. His kitchen? A synthesis of blandness. The faint smell of moldy bread lingered, as did the existential dread of wasted potential. As the sun began to set, and the twilight cast long shadows over the thatched roofs, Bertha knew that tonight was special. King Jacques III had put out a bounty on his cousin, the Duke of something or other. A total loser who spent too much time trying to impress oh-so-wealthy folks. Bertha had just the plan. He'd not just eliminate his cousin, but he'd do it with the utmost nonchalance. The tension rose as he steeled himself for the grandest of all grand entrances. A simple trip to the village tavern, where the locals gathered to drink watered-down ale and sip mediocre wine so sour it would put even vinegar to shame. Here, Bertha would blend in, mingle, and potentially orchestrate the demise of his target while partaking in some wonderfully bland stew. Because why not? Before stepping out, he recited the sacred ritual of the ordinary. A grease-stained handkerchief tucked awkwardly into his belt, a fake accent that screamed, "I'm boring and uninterested," and the time-honored principle of no eye contact with anyone who might know him. Convincing other wannabe assassins to don ordinary masks? A classic. He spent his days outing the rogue guild members, living up to that age-old mantra. The less they know, the less they suspect. Once nestled amidst the tavern hustle and cheap hay on the floor, Bertet suddenly faced the absurd realities of medieval dining etiquette. As he munched on those suspiciously lumpy potatoes that somehow masqueraded as food, he realized he was not the only one attempting to stay inconspicuous. Murmurs echoed around him about some rogue poacher allegedly snatching prized poultry from the local lord's yard. Oh, the scandal. As luck would have it, or a well-timed potato skin, in a moment of unintended chaos, Berta found himself knee-deep in a brawl triggered over the last hunk of stale bread. Suddenly, he was forced to negotiate the artistry of subtlety. The irony of drawing more attention to himself while trying to maintain a low profile was not lost on him. His cousin, that glorious target of destiny, sported a comically extravagant feathered hat. And watching him flail drunk amidst the tavern's best like a deranged peacock was the last thing he anticipated while merely trying to enjoy his bland supper. In the end, Berta had to ask himself, can one truly be an assassin in a world where subtlety is lost to poorly cooked stew and errant tavern fights? The lesson loomed larger, both tragic and comedic. With a swift kick to the nuisance of his cousin's feathered hat, his scheme became undone, resulting instead in a chase across the village, with one rather soggy potato thrown just for good measure. So, what's the takeaway? In a world of assassination, it seems what you truly need is a blend of ordinary and absurdity. If you want to live a long life as an assassin, just remember, blending in is great, but dodging flying potatoes is even better. Cue the dramatic music. The year, somewhere in the 15th century. The setting, a candlelit dining hall large enough to qualify as an echo chamber for paranoia. The air, thick with incense, political tension, and the faint whiff of undercooked goat. Enter the Sultan. Not just any sultan, the Sultan, absolute ruler of an empire so vast it would take 3 camels, 2 months, and a sturdy prayer to cross it. His royal court is assembled, his gold-plated spoon polished to an almost blinding sheen. Tonight's dinner? A humble bowl of lentil soup. In theory, harmless. In practice, potentially lethal. Because in the royal courts of history, soup wasn't just a starter. It was Russian roulette with chickpeas. See, back in the day, poisoning wasn't a side plot. It was a career strategy. You wanted promotion. You poisoned your boss. You wanted divorce. Poison the in-laws. You wanted to speed up succession. Put something extra in Papa's porridge. Which brings us back to the Sultan, the soup, and the impending existential crisis. The dish was prepared in the harem kitchen, a fortress of steel cauldrons, eunuch guards, and approximately 17 underpaid cooks who all lived in constant fear of sneezing in the direction of a royal plate. Everything had to pass a rigorous, slightly insane safety protocol. Step 1. The chief food taster, a man whose job description was literally first to die, would sip every dish while being watched by at least 6 scribes ready to write his obituary. Step 2. The soup was transferred into a gold-plated, pearl-inlaid, cursor-repelling bowl, just in case the poison was allergic to wealth. Step 3. The Grand Vizier's aunt's astrologer was consulted to ensure the planetary alignment wouldn't trigger invisible food demons. Step 4. Finally, the Sultan's most loyal servant would offer the soup while reciting a protective prayer that had been mistranslated so many times it now roughly meant, "May the beans be merciful." Despite all this, the minute the Sultan took a sip, a tiny sip, he frowned. The entire court froze. One guard dropped his scimitar. A musician in the back fainted into his lute. Was it too salty? Too bland? Or, the worst possibility, was it treacherous? Cue the chaos. The kitchen staff was interrogated faster than a Netflix crime doc. The food taster was missing. He'd actually just gone to the latrine. Rumors spread that a rival prince had bribed the spice merchant. Someone remembered seeing a cat near the lentils. Was it an assassin cat? Meanwhile, the Sultan sat silently, swirling the soup like it held the answers to the universe. Eventually, a physician was summoned, an expert in the medieval art of diagnosing everything as imbalance of humors. He sniffed the bowl, tasted it himself, then confidently declared, "Sire, it's cumin. Just a lot of cumin." Relieved murmurs. The lute player revived. The guards stood down. The cat was pardoned. And the soup? It was finished. Carefully, suspiciously, with a hint of lingering trauma, but the message was clear. Even soup can be suspect when your job comes with a crown and an invitation to be stabbed from 30 different directions. So what did we learn? Always taste test your broth, unless you're the Sultan. In that case, delegate, pray, and maybe order something less pourable. Picture this. The year is 1205. The scene is a dimly lit tavern in the heart of a bustling medieval town. The smell? A lovely bouquet of sweat, unwashed bodies, and what could only be described as yesterday's mutton stew. Somewhere nearby, a cat is eyeing a plate of sausages like a hungry assassin plotting its next move. Now enter our protagonist, a self-proclaimed medieval assassin named Thaddeus Slaymore. Thaddeus has all the flair of a rabid raccoon in a tuxedo. He believes himself destined for greatness, specifically the kind of fame that only comes from leaving a trail of legendary tales told with exaggerated hand gestures. You see, he wants to be famous enough to have his portrait painted, though given his current income, the artist is going to need some serious imagination. As Thaddeus bellows about his latest victory over a disgruntled baker who had the audacity to charge him a shilling for bread, the tavern erupts into laughter, mostly aimed at Thaddeus's poorly executed impression of an assassin's stealthy sneak. They can hear him coming from a mile away thanks to his glorious armor, which clinks and clanks like a wind chime factory caught in a thunderstorm. But the atmosphere quickly darkens, like the mood at a family dinner when the uncle who attempts magic tricks arrives. It turns out that the tavern's famous dish of the day, the pie of questionable origin, has been rumored to contain more than just meat. Local peasants whisper it's a favorite meal of the king himself, with a pinch of something else. A hefty serving of poison that's rumored to have made its way into a pie crust to settle old political scores. The patrons begin to squirm as Thaddeus believes he must partake. After all, nothing could elevate his fall from grace saga than to become the first man to die while trying to impress a group of inebriated peasants. Moreover, in true comedic chaos, Thaddeus thought he'd won a future in shady history. He was desperate for that story of fame. with the light of a flickering candle reflecting off greasy faces, the tension builds. Patrons take turns attempting to push Thaddeus into sharing the pie, with threats ranging from drunken jests to legends of past victims whose last words involved pie, all while someone in the corner is loudly reciting entirely incorrect historical facts about the Black Plague as if it were an MMA announcement. Thaddeus, of course, turns pale, not just from fear of the reputed poison, but from the realization that his own fame could very well end after one bite of the dreaded pastry. As he prepares himself for the initial test, he stares at the pie, pondering how he wanted to be remembered: devourer of delicious danger, or merely that guy who couldn't handle his dessert. At this critical moment, a drunken bard stumbles in and shouts, "One does not simply eat pie without a song." He begins to belt out a ludicrous tune filled with misguided medieval history and completely inaccurate information about assassination techniques, urging Thaddeus on in the most over-the-top fashion imaginable. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the crowd, the pie's secret ingredient just so happens to be a particularly potent spice mistaken for poison: thyme. And packaged in a glorious explosion of flavor. So, as Thaddeus bravely takes a stab, quite literally, at the pie, everyone holds their breath. Is it fame, or is it a grave? As he gulps, he realizes that perhaps the only thing dangerous about it was the truth of his culinary choices. Surprisingly, the tavern erupts with cheers as Thaddeus survives the unpoisoned pie that transforms him into a local legend for all of 2 days before an actual assassin claims his rightful place in the folklore, further enhancing the lesson of how ephemeral fame can be. And thus we conclude that in an age where whispers of greatness carried faster than the scent of bad bread, if you live by fame, you might just find that it dies by pie. Ah, the 13th century, a glorious time when everyone wore tunics and social mobility meant switching from one type of serfdom to another. Picture this: a dark, damp alley in the heart of a grimy medieval town, where the only thing thicker than the fog is the sense of existential dread. Rats scurry across cobblestones, while the air is a medley of stale bread, unwashed bodies, and that unmistakable note of impending doom as the Black Plague knocks politely on the door. Enter our protagonist, a lowly assassin who, let's face it, was about as likely to die young as a character in a Shakespearean tragedy. Meet Harold, the silent but deadly of the Assassination Guild. He's a man of two great loves: poetry and poison. Unfortunately, his knack for the creative arts was eclipsed only by his spectacularly short life expectancy. Consider the position of an assassin. 1 minute you're sipping your morning mead, the next you're the target of a grotesque game of cat and mouse set amidst political intrigue. Talk about a job with its fair share of occupational hazards. The atmosphere resembles something out of a nightmare. Torchlit streets echo with hushed whispers of betrayal and delusions of grandeur. The perfumes of Pastis Prime beef stew and anxiety mingle in the air, creating a delightful bouquet of medieval malaise. Every corner is an opportunity for backstabbing, literally. The clanking of armor can be heard in the distance, and the appointment of the newest lord has lured out many an overly ambitious assassin willing to risk life and limb, and often limb was a given. As an assassin, there were certain meals that came with absurdly ritualistic procedures, akin to a Thanksgiving family feud, but with deadlier consequences. day of the job? Well, wouldn't you know it, you might want to avoid spaghetti if assassination is on the agenda, since it's not exactly stealthy. Instead, to bolster their bravery, assassins would partake in a fortifying dish known as the Three-Death Stew, so named not for its robust flavor, but for how many times it's thought to have replaced the original cook. Flavored by a rogue's gallery of herbs believed to tempt fate, this feast was seasoned with portions of paranoia and garnished with a side of imminent doom. The chefs, skilled as they were in the culinary arts, often couldn't tell the difference between seasoning and actual poison. They were artists, not chemists. Before each meal, there were superstitions to uphold. For instance, a true craftsman in the art of assassination needed to avoid eggs. Every assassin knew eggs were just tragic orbs of destiny. Just as one might think they were indulging in a protein-packed gift from the heavens, they'd instead end up mercilessly assassinated by the probability of elevating their chances of dying by breakfast. Anxiety rose each time Harold and his compatriots prepared to feast. Did we add Noble's tears again, or was it Gopher's blood? The kitchen was a minefield of bizarre recipes, often lashed with curses and accusations that would leave anyone craving or questioning their life choices. The irony? The dining table served as both a banquet and a tribunal. One blunder, and those stilts built on bread would become breakfast for crows. As the tension climaxed, Harold's luck seemingly paid off on every attempt, until one fateful night. He was gearing up for what was meant to be an easy elimination of a traitorous duke. Sulking in a hidden alcove, while secretly hoping that a lack of relaxation would stick it to the man, Harold made himself a light snack to soothe his nerves. An ill-considered veal tart, way past its prime and decidedly rogue in composition. The tart turned out to be, surprise, surprise, the best meat choice for dinner, his last dinner. The predictable twist? The veal tart turned out to be not merely bad, but, in a whimsical turn of fate, a ticket to the underworld. Poisoned by his own meal, he was found the next morning, stone-cold and less of a threat than even the rats skimming the alley walls. Irony dosed with a dark humor. He died not from the blade of an enemy, but from the questionable culinary skills of the local butcher. Who would have guessed that your average culinary adventure could turn into a death sentence for an assassin? In summary, the medieval world taught us one critical truth. The life expectancy of an assassin was remarkably shorter than the lifespan of a loaf of sourdough. And, at the end of the day, it only matters how well you can dodge the destiny gifted to you from both blades and veal. So, aspiring assassins, take heed. Embrace the medieval culinary arts, but for goodness sake, skip the questionable pastries. Cue the dramatic music. The year, somewhere in the Dark Ages when hygiene was a polite suggestion and feudal lords were practicing their best side glances. The setting, a damp subterranean banquet hall. It was terrifyingly lit by torches that flickered like the sanity of the attendees. The air? Heavy with the delicious scent of roasted rabbit mingled with the rancid odor of betrayal. Enter the Duke of Doomshire, whose title reflected his uncanny ability to ruin dinner parties and lives with equal flair. Sporting a doublet so extravagant it could be considered a violation of fabric laws, he surveyed his loyal, if somewhat jittery, court. Tonight's menu was no mere feast. It was a calculated game of chances dressed up as supper. Lords and ladies stared hungrily at a platter piled high with what they hoped was roasted rabbit, or possibly last week's assassinated noble, the previous host, who had mysteriously dropped dead over a bowl of grape stew. We'll never know. Dreadfully aware that any dish could be the last course, there was urgency. Not for the food itself, but for the intrigue simmering alongside it. The Duke had long made enemies, mostly those who dared to patronize rival hat makers or question his extraordinary need for vibrant plumage. The dinner began with a toast, a clinking of goblets filled suspiciously with something warm and a disconcertingly rich hue. The court's food taster, an unfortunate soul named Reginald, stepped up to his noble duty, literally standing at the precipice of fate, ready to face the consequences of the Duke's spicy temper. Now, here's where the absurdity kicks in. Reginald had survived exactly 3 meals before tonight, having been lodged into the Duke's favor with promises of generous portions and a good amount of regret for any bad pipe music. Legend had it that he could dodge arrows, a skill that was unhelpful when the Duke himself fancied a slice of vengeance. As the taster sipped the beverage, one could hear a pin drop, or rather the echo of an entire cheese wheel rolling off the table due to the sheer tension. Well, he swallowed, and lo and behold, he had just enough time to consider the course of his life when the Duke eyed him suspiciously. "I expect nothing but the sharpest flavor for my palate, Reginald," he sneered, forcing a candelabra to tremble with a pointed glare. With cider dripping from his chin, Reginald's mind raced. Was it the hair that made him choke, or the silent threat from the Duke's expansive collection of dodgeballs hidden about? As Reginald sought to placate a very hungry man with questionable mental stability, he suddenly recalled the kitchen rumors. The chef had incorrectly infused the soup with boar's blood, thinking it would add a kick. Just what you want in your political meal, right? The tension reached a boiling point when Reginald, in a moment of culinary epiphany, started sprinkling random herbs, most of which had been used in medieval magic potions. The whole court watched in a finely tuned mix of shock and hope, praying he wouldn't accidentally summon a Wendigo, or worse, make the Duke allergic. Then came the twist. The Duke took a monumental sip, and for a moment everything stopped. The jesters paused their moronic dances, the servants froze mid-service, and the room collectively held its breath, which smelled surprisingly of garlic. The Duke, eyes wide as saucers, suddenly grinned. He exhaled loudly. Delightful, an acquired taste. He declared, unwittingly damning himself to one more dinner. Cheers erupted, and the cutthroat atmosphere transformed into temporary elation, creating a fleeting sense that perhaps dynasties could survive on rabbit and poor culinary decision-making. Reginald, spared yet again from his tragic fate, relished the applause, momentarily forgetting the fate of his predecessors. So, what's the lesson to take home? In the cutthroat world of medieval dining, you'll learn 2 things. Always choose a food taster slightly older than last Thursday's leftovers. And if an angry Duke is sipping your concoction, pray he's more pleased than poisoned. Food for thought, right? Light flickers eerily in the year of our Lord 1457 as we find ourselves in the dank walls of an old stone castle where the temperature is a balmy 50 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for potential assassins and spoiled dairy. The air is thick with the delicious yet deadly scent of overcooked pigeon, accompanied by the robust stink of unwashed peasants and the general hostility of life in the Middle Ages. Gather round a long wooden table, where lords with more gold than sense sit, and scratch their beards while admiring the artisanal craftsmanship of their pewter mugs. The main course? A rather suspicious-looking stew, an ensemble cast of random meats and vegetables, all vying for the audience's attention, much like the courtiers hoping to be the next person brought down in a tragic case of medieval mismanagement. See, in those dubious days, food wasn't merely sustenance, it was the ultimate test of loyalty and cunning. Nobility presumed they were forever under threat from the elusive assassin, an existential idea that made their lives equally thrilling and baffling. You see, the culinary strategies of the time were heavily influenced by paranoia, where the threat of poisoning was more prevalent than a bad case of chronic dysentery. Picture this. Sitting across from King Richard the Something, his nobles are engaged in their own version of MasterChef, contemplating not just the flavors of their encapsulated nightmare stew, but potentially their own mortality. You'd hear the ruckus of the upper crust muttering superstitions like a cow's fart at midnight means doom. And if the soup bubbles ominously, it's definitely a sign of treachery. Before they dug into their diner of death bowl, they'd solemnly chant things like, "May the fates spare my marrow and my spleen." Ah, nothing like a little tableside ritual before indulging in a possible assassination attempt. The tension embarks on a hyperbolic ascent as Richard the Something lifts his wooden spoon. At that moment, every servant in the room freezes, each hand trembling over their respective meal. The first taste brings the kind of horrifying gasp that occasionally precedes an execution. Would it be too much time? An accidental hint of arsenic? Or perhaps the chicken had simply been too close to an unwashed serf? As the pressure builds, all eyes turn to Edwin the chief food taster, whose own history is essentially a sad opera of violent deaths wrapped in mysterious culinary disasters. Edwin cautiously leans in, sweat beading visibly upon his brow, then declares, "Sire, the flavor conveys both courage and dread. And, oh, is that bitter?" As the court collectively swallows their own anxiety, tempers flare. In classic medieval fashion, fingers point, and heads roll in fiery debates of, "Did you taste it before I did?" Suddenly, a loud crash reveals a servant tripping over a much-hated cat that somehow wandered into the dining room. The cat, arguably the least popular entity of the evening, flops to the table with its own agenda: distraction. The noblemen are momentarily distracted, their minds lightening in the tangle of fur and furor. Then, lo and behold, out pops a nub from the stew, a rotten turnip. The court erupts into a fracas, shouting accusations of negligence against the chef, while Edwin, now relieved of being the centerpiece of death, laughs hysterically. In the whirlwind of chaos and rotten vegetables, the truth is unearthed. It was not treachery afoot, just an overzealous sack of produce that had definitely overstayed its welcome in the pantry. And perhaps the ultimate medieval lesson: when you think you're about to bite into someone's betrayal, sometimes you just need a snobby cat and a stale root vegetable to remind you it was merely the cook's culinary blunder instead. So, here's the takeaway. Never trust a stew that is served with a side of political intrigue. or that holds more threats than your local Halloween haunted house. Picture it. 1327 AD, a hidden alcove under the colonnades of the magnificent Basilica of St. Ambrose in Milan. The light flickers as a lone candle fights desperately against the damp darkness, casting shadows that would make even a ghost shiver. The air is thick with the sense of betrayal and something utterly revolting. The unmistakable aroma of old fish and melted cheese, remnants of a dinner long forgotten, or perhaps just the consequence of medieval culinary genius. Enter the unsuspecting apprentice assassin, a scruffy lad with dreams based on tales of glittering daggers and legendary deeds. Tonight, he is offered an opportunity, a slice of bread topped with what the locals affectionately and hopefully call cheese, although its resemblance to yellow goo might leave one questioning its identity. In this society, food was often not just sustenance but a delicate game of survival. Assassins congregated here to weather yet another paranoid evening of plotting to thin the ranks of nobles standing between them and their aspirations of fame, or at least a cheap ale. They prepared their spirits with meals akin to the CIA's finest psychological training simulations, overly seasoned to the point of distraction, garnished with superstition, and served with a side of existential dread. Consider the spread of the evening, a banquet of soggy bread and the infamous fish and cheese mystery dish, anchored in numerous conspiratorial beliefs. Why was it fish and cheese? Because someone decided that two of the worst things to consume should form a culinary marriage as a tribute to the divine chaos of the universe. Moreover, each item came with a whispered warning from the local wise woman, claiming the fish was harvested during the last full moon, when hagfish spirits were known to be particularly vengeful. Tension thickens as our apprentice looks down at his plate, feeling the weight of fate, or perhaps just really bad dinner. His fellow assassins, a merry band of men equally disillusioned by the notion that stabbing people would instantly lead to a better life, proclaim loudly about how anyone who dares to nibble on this abomination is poised to meet the grim reapers a tad quicker than anticipated. You see, the fish was glorious, but it could also yield nightmares about the Fisher's Almanac, a cursed tome rumored to lay waste to the souls of those who attempt to cook seafood. No pressure. Then, as if the universe felt it necessary to cap this already ludicrous scene, a furious knock echoes through the hall. Enter the guildmaster, his stature dwarfing the apprentice, adorned in a leather jerkin that smelled more of sweat than victory. He huffs out threats that no one could hear over their collective stomach churn and warns of impending doom from a rival guild. The apprentices, wise beyond their years but desperate for a good meal, suddenly abandon their distrustful glances towards the supper. They realize it was now or never. With conspiratorial haste, they unceremoniously dive into the fish-cheese monstrosity with such unfiltered vigor that they could be mistaken for starving creatures feeding on an unholy sacrifice. But suddenly, amidst the mouthfuls of the unappetizing delicacy, inspiration strikes. The apprentice leads a rallying cry to the shadows to honor their fallen comrades who inevitably perished after a night of recklessness involving said fish. They raise their sweaty bread like ancient relics, poetically declaring, "If we die tonight, at least at the hands of fishy cheese." Just when it seems camaraderie has conquered all, the guildmaster, clearly unimpressed, emerges with a plate of his version of fish, perfectly fried and glistening like the full moon. In a display of gourmet superiority, he hands out tasting portions, forcing all present to realize they had just consumed the medieval equivalent of a kitchen accident. What started in tragedy concluded with verbal barbs exchanged, hazardously sinister snickers, and a lesson learned. When life hands you fish and cheese, the answer isn't always noble assassination. Sometimes it's culinary improvisation rising from the ashes of existential dread. So, what's the takeaway? In a world full of culinary chaos, just remember, not all fish should wed cheese, and if they do, you might want to run for your life. As we reach the grand finale of our medieval plunge into the filth-ridden world of assassins, let's take a moment to reflect on a rather curious trait of humanity: our deluded belief that we are in control of nature. After all, what is an assassin amidst the endless pantomime of history? A mere puppet on strings pulled by the hands of society, which often forgets to consider that every creature has a penchant for vengeance. Yes, while we humans fancy ourselves as the apex predators, striding confidently through life with the idea that we're dominating the animal kingdom, we often forget the harsh reality. Animals may not plot revenge in secret meetings, but they certainly have been known to get back at us in more expressive ways than mere dagger-toting. Let us take a stroll down the not-so-cuddly memory lane of animal vengeance, shall we? From the vengeful antics of elephants trampling poachers to the not-so-tender embrace of a swan biting the hand that feeds, it's as if animals are all where we get to practice for our grand cosmic stage show of retribution. Even birds don't miss a beat when it comes to expressing their discontent. Look out, for the skies may erupt with urine bombs courtesy of outraged pigeons. So, in a world that can often seem tyrannical, where peasants plot against lords and windows are merely the view for a kill, we should never underestimate our furry friends' capacity for retribution. Are you furrowing your brows at that idea? Well, maybe the dog isn't eagerly wagging his tail at you for affection. Maybe he's winding up for the moment you slip that last slice of pizza into your mouth. He's merely biding his time, the perfect assassin himself, creeping closer to his ultimate goal of pizza domination. If only the medieval assassins had observed a simple dog trick-or-treat philosophy, perhaps their endeavors would have ended on a happier note, like getting pats instead of daggers. And so, dear audience, as we conclude our wild and absurd journey through the morose existence of medieval assassins, let us take this final lesson to heart. Control is but an illusion, and when the dog looks harmless, remember that sometimes he's not just the cute, fluffy sidekick to our lives. He's the saboteur of your leftovers, ready to execute his plans with the same finesse as any historical operative. This has been a gripping journey through anguish and absurdity, and if you remember anything, let it be this. When faced with the decision between pizza and a barking dog, choose wisely. After all, history teaches us one thing. You never know when the cleaners will come for you.